A critical way to really work with insulin resistance is to make sure that you're maintaining your muscle mass or even growing it as you get older, and to be paying attention to some of the things that allow you to perform.
Dr. Sara Gottfried.
Jeff Krasno.
What a treat. Here we are.
Yes.
In the dance. We are answering questions. The royal we. I say you are answering questions.
You're answering too.
I'm playing along. From our burgeoning community here, who seems to have a bevy of questions for you about health in all of its aspects. And this one was from Lauren. And I'll give you a little background on Lauren. She identifies as someone who is doing all the things, quote unquote. What does that mean? Well, she's really taking good care of herself. She says that there is an assumption that metabolic dysfunction and insulin resistance only develops in people eating the standard American diet or living a sedentary lifestyle, etc. But she wants to know, what are the hidden causes for insulin resistance? Like, some people are fit, they're leading active lifestyles, they're eating right, but they're still developing insulin resistance. And specifically, does sports or being athletic or endurance sports play a potential role in insulin resistance? What do you say to that?
Such an important topic. And this is one of those situations where I'm raising my hand as well, because I was Lauren and I had significant insulin resistance, even when I feel like I dialed in my a healthy diet. And we can talk about that, how personalization really needs to happen. And I discovered that the kind of exercise I was doing was not the right exercise for insulin resistance. I was a chronic cardio type and a runner. I was running about 4 miles 4 to 5 times a week, and it just was driving my cortisol high, which is kind of another way of creating insulin resistance. I also have genetics that program me to be, I've got thrifty genes. I'll just put it that way. So I am programmed to survive a potato famine. I'm programmed to survive many different ways of restricting food and living off of the fat in my body for a very long time. And I also had issues with food addiction, with disordered eating. And as a result of that, gut issues that I think became such that I had bacteria that were harvesting excess calories from the food that I was eating. So there's lots of different directions to go, but I would say toxic stress, genetics, chronic cardio, and then disordered eating are kind of the first things that I think of as hidden causes for insulin resistance. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I can turn the mirror right there on myself with essentially all of those bullet points. I'll start on the cardio side. Like you, I was chronic cardio, and I really, favored the aerobic exercises that also kind of are categorized as play. So tennis, for example, I was a competitive tennis player. I'd go out and play like 2 hours of like hardcore singles, and, with the assumption that that was quote unquote good for me. Now, I'm sure we could make some case for, I don't know, like just heart health that maybe, yes, that could be considered good for you. But for, then once I started wearing my continuous glucose monitor, I would see massive glucose spikes during and after like long periods of cardio like that. Now, okay, some of that seems to make sense to me. As I would unwind it, I would be like, oh yeah, I'm essentially putting myself into fight or flight. I'm like, out here running as if my evolution would recognize that as like a kind of sympathetic with a sympathetic response and the kind of dominoes that fall there down from the HPA axis to my adrenals and to the creation of cortisol. Cortisol is going to then stimulate my liver to secrete glucose out to my extremities because I'm running around and I need that energy, right? So that totally makes sense. But my assumption was always that like, yeah, but long term, that's so long, like short term, that might not be great, but long term, it's actually going to make me more insulin sensitive. But I don't really know if that was totally true. So I don't know if how would you diagnose that? I mean, and I think this might be what Lauren's getting at. She's probably hardcore cardio. That's an assumption. But is that actually something we should be doing as it pertains to insulin resistance?
It's a good question. So I feel like I've changed my answer to this over time. Mm-hmm. We were taught when I went through my medical training, 150 minutes of exercise. Like that's kind of the base standard. And we also told people to do cardio because we thought that was the most heart healthy. And we've really changed over time. So what we've seen is that weight training is really critical, especially for glucose disposal, because we know that chronic cardio running, I know less about tennis, but running certainly raises your cortisol high. And if you think of marathon runners as an example, they're not always the picture of health. They can look kind of inflamed. They can look kind of hollowed out, and they can have that kind of haggard, high cortisol look to them. Yeah. And so what you're describing with wearing a continuous glucose monitor and having those high glucose spikes with the exercise that you were doing, I see that in professional athletes as well. Not all of them. But I've got some NBA players who spike their glucose to 200 when they're in their training mode during the season. And I have one in particular who was told by his team doctor that it was totally fine. It wasn't a problem because he just has, kind of this physiological adaptation to his training load. And I disagree. I think there's consequences, as you said, long-term consequences to getting your glucose so high in terms of what that does to the blood vessel. Mm-hmm. So this is a place where looking under the hood, getting some additional data, and then doing some N-of-1 experiments can be very helpful. And I know you've done this. So wearing a continuous glucose monitor can really help. I found that when I shifted from obsessively doing the Peloton, I loved Robin Arzon and I loved Power Zone training with Matt Wilpers. Yeah. And I was somewhat addicted to it. Just like I used to have some food addiction, I have an addictive personality. And I was doing that 5-6 days a week, spinning for 45 minutes plus. And I really noticed that my glucoses were a little too high in response to this. When I started to bring in more weight training, it really changed the story. And I think you found that as well.
100%. Really, I mean, we've talked about this in the past, but when I started resistance training, that was like the cherry on the top of glucose management.
I think we need a different analogy than the cherry on top.
Jesus, that's not good. How about
the avocado slice on top?
On top. Where, as I built more lean muscle, I saw my blood glucose get really regulated. And that's obviously because the more muscle uptakes glucose, even in the absence of insulin when it's contracted, as far as I understand. So,
that's right.
So this was a huge deal for me, and really just it just completely changed my metabolic health. So I would say, from my personal experience to Lauren, if you are focused on cardio or aerobic exercise, start to balance that with resistance or strength training, even to the point where maybe you're doing more resistance or strength training than you are aerobic.
Do the experiment. Do the experiment. So what I have some folks do is kind of 50-50 weight training and cardio. Some people do better with 2/3 weight training and 1/3 cardio. I think you need both, but you got to find the ratio that works for you.
Yeah. So then the other one that you mentioned that's sort of a North Star, I think, for a lot of people is stress management.
Huge.
And, for me, obviously, I have a lot of tools, a lot of arrows in the quiver, if you will, just given what I do and my access to a lot of wonderful meditation teachers, et cetera, breathwork teachers. And certainly those protocols have become completely central to my life. But are there, what would you say are the top 2 or 3 protocols that you would recommend for stress management? And how does that make a difference for metabolic health?
This is another place where it's critical to personalize. So yes, there are so many techniques that are available. And what works for you, what worked for me at 17 was transcendental meditation and yoga. And that worked really well for me, like through my 30s. And then it didn't work as well. And I was noticing that I had more toxic stress. And so that got me to take a step back and look at, okay, what about trauma? Small t trauma that I've had in my life. And so I would encourage Lauren to do the ACE questionnaire. Start there. Look at some of the adverse childhood experiences that could be contributing to cortisol load and could be leading to problems with insulin resistance. We know that people who have an abnormal ACE score, which is 1 or higher, and that's true for 60% of us, there's a greater risk of insulin resistance in developing type 2 diabetes, as well as about almost 40 other chronic health conditions. Another piece that I think is interesting to layer in is the highly sensitive person. Have you heard about this HSP phenomenon, Jeff?
No, but I'm sensitive to it.
So I discovered that I am HSP.
Oh.
So about 20% of the population is exquisitely sensitive to their environment. We're the sentries, we're the people who are constantly scanning the environment and often getting overstimulated, which can set off a stress response, kind of this cortisol response. You talked about fight or flight and how tennis was kind of activating some of those pathways. And I would say fight or flight actually works pretty well to mobilize stress in the body. It's the responses that I was having, things like freezing, fawning, not mobilizing, that led to kind of this chronic stress response that I never completely resolved or restored. And so learning about the highly sensitive type, you can go to, the author is Elaine Aron, and maybe we can link to this. She's written some books about this. You can do an online questionnaire, which is like 26 different questions related to your sensitivity to the environment. It includes things like, do perfumes trigger you? Do loud noises trigger you? So about 20% of the population is really sensitive to their environment. 80% are not. We live in a world that's relatively insensitive. So for those of us who are sensitive, it can really cause stress and cortisol problems. So it's good to know that about you. There's also this piece of kind of matching your genetics and your environment. Yeah. So HSP is one layer of that. But I found that I wasn't great at kind of architecting my environment to match my genome, to match my sensitivity. So sometimes it's worthwhile to do some inventory on that particular regard and see if there's some adjustments that need to be made in the way that you architect your life.
So in that way, do you mean, or are you referring to certain genetic predispositions that would, or certain genetics that might predispose you to insulin resistance, such that, like in the case of like the thrifty gene that you mentioned, like that over time there were certain adaptive changes in certain groups of humans that, favored the storing of fat, for example, as warehoused energy because generations upon generations had experienced famine or something like that. So is that an example of how someone might be genetically inclined to insulin resistance?
Yes, and it's a complicated topic. I would say it's not quite as simple as many of us would like it to be. Mm-hmm. but there's a few different flavors to it. So certainly there's the thrifty genes that we've identified that help you survive a famine. But then when you want to, get more cut and solve your insulin resistance, it can be really challenging and work against you.
Right.
There's also different single nucleotide polymorphisms or gene variations that might make you respond to saturated fat differently than someone else. So for instance, when I was eating, I think this woman asked about clean eating, which she defined as Mediterranean food plan or a paleo food plan. When I was eating paleo and also a Mediterranean diet, I was insulin resistant. I was gaining weight on those food plans. Probably on paleo, it was because I was having too much saturated fat and that was not working with my genetics. And then on a Mediterranean diet, it was just too carby for me at that time. So legumes were spiking my glucose, sweet potatoes, pretty much any form of potatoes and fruit were spiking my glucose excessively. And it's really about spiky, how spiky you are. Mm-hmm. That's what creates inflammation and can, continue this ball rolling toward insulin resistance. So I think it's important to, if you're able to look at your gene environment interaction, do some basic genetic testing. The way I like to test it is to look at pathways. But we're still in the learning to crawl phase, honestly, with this, because a lot of the genetics, when you look at glucose and insulin management, I would say when the Human Genome Project was underway, there was the hope that, maybe there's like 3 to 5 genes that are involved in glucose and insulin. No, there's thousands of gene interactions. It's such a complex phenomenon, and we're still not totally on top of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we covered stress management, and then also physical activity. What were the other ones that you mentioned that were, I think you rattled off 4 quite fluently.
So disordered eating.
Yeah.
And that certainly affects women more than men, although men suffer as well. And I feel like disordered eating is so much more common than we realize. I really learned as a kid to eat to try to change my emotional state. Yeah. And that's not really the purpose of food. Purpose of food is to fuel. And so for me to conflate those things, to want especially carbohydrates mixed with fat, yum. Yeah. But it's the most inflammatory combination that you can possibly do. I mean, really with food plans, you either need to be low fat, high carb,
right, or
low carb, high fat.
Yeah.
Not high carb, high fat.
Yeah.
And that's what food addiction does. That's what disordered eating does.
And that's what our American diet
Yes,
more
that's
or less
a sad
is.
diet.
Yeah. Is that you're stimulating high levels of insulin to store fat and then also having an extremely large input of calories.
Right.
So the mix of those is caustic.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. What other kind of hormonal kind of matrices are involved with insulin resistance? I mean, so many of these hormones that we discuss are counter-regulatory, right? So we talked about like how cortisol, the kind of that relationship between cortisol and insulin. Are there other forms of relationships that might lead to explain Lauren's insulin resistance? There's
a lot of them.
Yeah.
So, I think of leptin, I think of ghrelin, I think of, we talked about cortisol. And then for women starting around age 35 to 40, there's the relationship between estradiol here, and insulin. So women become more insulin resistant as they get older, as estrogen production starts to wane. They have these changes in body composition that are just kind of part of the normal progression, where after age 40, you're gaining 5 pounds of fat, you're losing 5 pounds of muscle, unless you're specifically doing something about it. So that estradiol insulin relationship, I think, is really important to understand. And then I think of muscle as an endocrine organ in many ways. Yeah. It serves so many different functions. And I love the work of Gabrielle Lyon, who talks about how muscle is an organ of health span. It's an organ of longevity. And so a critical way, it feels like we keep coming back to the same answer. A critical way to really work with insulin resistance is to make sure that you're maintaining your muscle mass or even growing it as you get older, and to be paying attention to some of the things that allow you to perform with strength training, like great sleep, protecting your sleep hygiene. So there's some other fundamental things. I think of growth hormone. I think of testosterone. I think of thyroid playing a role as well. It's not as direct in terms of insulin resistance, but there's definitely a tie between insulin resistance and being hypothyroid. I wrote about that in my most recent book. So yeah, there's a lot of hormonal players. It might sound somewhat complicated and a little overwhelming, but the answers are really relatively simple, which is to pay attention to your stress. Are you getting too much cardio and not enough strength training? And then maybe consider genomics.
Yeah, on the muscle as an endocrine organ, there's these, myokines, I guess they're called, right?
Yes.
So myo is muscle and kines. What does kines actually mean? That's just like,
I think signaling yeah. molecules.
I've heard them referred to kind of broadly. I know there's specific ones like irisin or something like that,
yes.
that I think leads to the development of, BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, this particular protein that helps neurons continue to function well, but actually seems to be responsible for neurogenesis, so creation of new neurons even after the time you're 25, which is, of course, contrary to what we were taught for a very long time. So that's very hopeful right there. It's even so far as like sometimes these hormones that are coming from muscles are known as hope molecules. I've been hearing that, which is a slightly woo-woo nomenclature, but I've enjoyed it. Are there any particular ethnicities that are more predisposed to insulin resistance?
Oh, certainly. So the Latinx population is, it's well documented that there's more insulin resistance. I think of Native Americans and their risk. The Pima Indians are the ones that have been studied the most. But I lived in Alaska when I was growing up, and certainly the Native Americans in Alaska have issues with insulin resistance. So yes, there are certain populations, and then there are also populations that have social determinants of health that can lead to greater insulin resistance, like more racial weathering among folks that are Black, and more cortisol problems, kind of chronic cortisol problems, less access to healthcare, food deserts. So there's certain races and ethnicities that have more social determinants of health that increase the risk of insulin resistance.
Yeah. I was looking at some of the data around the prevalence of diabetes among the female Black community, and it is just awful.
It's devastating.
Yeah.
And, so much of the research that we have right now is skewed toward white populations. And that's a real problem, especially with genetic, kind of gene environment studies. But fortunately, we're starting to change that. Mm-hmm. And we know that when you look at multiracial cohorts, like the MESA study, I think is called, they found that Black women have more racial weathering than any other race or demographic. There's a way that Black women are holding stress and racism and discrimination, and it's got major downstream health consequences that we really need to be paying attention to.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you, Sara. Oh, it was a treat. And Lauren, I hope this provides some window into your insulin resistance. Hey, thanks a lot for watching. If you liked this Q&A from the Commune podcast,
then I think you'll love this video right here.